When Ronald Reagan was president of the United States, he and his wife Nancy helped to launch an anti-drug campaign. And their intention was to persuade young people to be able to have the power to say no to drugs. And I remember the slogan, I actually heard it, it's just say no. That's what they were trying to promote. And the president put all his power behind this. He sent one of his top aides out throughout the country, going around just trying to raise awareness about this. And one time they were actually in the Bronx in New York City and at a high school of 3,000 kids. And after he gave his motivational speech, he then decided he had made his point, but he still wanted to carry that just a little further. So he called for volunteers. And one young guy raised his hand, so the aide brought him up onto the stage. And as soon as he got onto the stage, the aide said, "Thank you for volunteering. Now I want you to take your clothes off." And the young guy is kind of shocked, and he says, "No, I'm not taking my clothes off." And then the aide goes, "Do you realize who I am? I know the most powerful person in our country. I have his phone number. I can call him right now, and the president can tell you to take your clothes off." "Well, I don't care who you get on the phone. I'm not going to take my clothes off." And then he goes, "You want money." So he pulled a $20 bill. This is quite a few years ago. $20 was a lot of money. He pulled a $20 bill out of his pocket, and he said, "Here, I'll give you this if you'll take your clothes off." And once again, he said, "No, you can give me $100, and I'm not taking my clothes off." So then the motivational speaker, he still wouldn't stop. And in one final attempt, he turned to the assembly hall, so full room, just like here, 2,999 kids, and he said, "Do you want him to take his clothes off?" And they all start chanting, "Take your clothes off, take your clothes off." And he said, "They can chant all day, but I'm leaving my clothes on." And that's when the speaker turned to the boy and said, "Do you know what you've just done? You said no to doing something dumb. You said no to your peers. You said no to power. You said no to money. So if you've been able to say no here, you can go out into the world. You can go back home and you can say no as well." The campaign did a little bit of good, but it didn't really accomplish all that they wanted to. And that's probably because they were trying to get people to to avoid something negative as opposed to doing something positive. Now, James and I, our hope in our teaching over this next 6 weeks is that we can motivate you to start actually praying this prayer every day. "Lord, help me to say yes to you." And we could think of it this way. It's easier to say no when there's a deeper burning yes within us, because a yes to the Lord means a no to the world. So we're looking at a man by the name of Abraham. We're going to be in Genesis chapter 22. And Abraham said yes to God, even when he didn't understand what God was asking of him. And the entire chapter is all about the choices that Abraham could make. He could say yes to what he thought made sense, or he could say yes to God and surrender his will to God's plan. So we see the dreaded call, and we're picking it up in verse 1. After these things, God tested Abraham's faith, and God said to him, "Abraham," and he answered, "Here I am." And then God said, "Take your only son Isaac, the son you love, and go to the land of Moriah. Kill him there and offer him as a whole burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about." Now that's the worst possible request that God could make of a parent. No matter how much that kid is bugging you, this is the worst thing. And it was especially true for Abraham, because he and Sarah had been trying for so many years to have a child. And finally, Abraham's 100, Sarah's 90, and they have a child between the two of them. And now God is asking them to actually sacrifice Isaac. But God intervened miraculously when Abraham was 100 and Sarah was 90, and he brought that amazing child into their life. And now for him to think about actually taking the life of that child. Have you ever received a horrible call? It might not have been an audible voice from God. It might even have been your worst enemy. It could have been a best friend. I get phone calls every week from people who have just experienced an incredible tragedy in their life. And a week never seems to go by without one of those. So maybe it'll be you or me that gets that dreaded call this week. Or you might continue to kind of coast through life crises-free for quite some time. But I want you to know that God says there will be a crisis at some point. The Bible promises adversity. In James 1, James said, "My brothers and sisters, when you have many kinds of troubles, you should be full of joy." So he's saying trials are going to come. But remember, there was a promise that was found in the Old Testament, and it's also here in the New Testament in Hebrews 13. God has said, "I will never leave you. I will never abandon you." So God has said, I'm here for you. So we shouldn't let that dreaded call ruin us. Abraham would find that out soon enough. But then the next step is his obedient response. And it seems as if Abraham is going along with this request. He's putting himself in a situation where he can say no to God. So we pick up in verse 3. Abraham got up early in the morning and saddled his donkey. He took Isaac and 2 servants with him. And after he cut the wood for the sacrifice, they went to the place God had told them to go. So that you can understand the setting here, I want to remind you of the promise that God made to Abraham, that he would have all of these descendants. And now he's being asked to kill this son. So he's being asked to cut off that family tree. So Abraham's got to be thinking, I don't understand this in any way whatsoever. Make up your mind, God. I'm going to have all these descendants, and you're asking me to take the life of this child. So years later, over in the New Testament, God gives us a little bit of insight into what was going on with Abraham, his line of reasoning, and that's in Hebrews 11. It was by faith that Abraham, when God tested him, offered his son Isaac as a sacrifice. God made the promises to Abraham, but Abraham was ready to offer his own son as a sacrifice. And God had said, "The descendants I promise you will be from Isaac." And Abraham believed that God could raise the dead. Now that's great faith. It was one where he believed, if God wants me to take the life of my son, then somehow God is going to bring him back to life again. And he had nothing to go by. He had no examples to go by. He didn't have the example of Jesus' friend Lazarus that we talked about on Easter Sunday. He didn't have the example of Jairus' daughter that Jesus raised back to life again. And he didn't have the example of Jesus and his resurrection. He's got none of that. And here he is with this obedient response that he makes. And that obedient response is made possible for you and me when we rely upon the Holy Spirit. Because when we rely upon the flesh, when we rely just upon ourselves and our own strength, our own power, we lose out, we're weak. And that's why we continue to make the same mistakes over and over and over again. And we get frustrated. Why did I do that again? Or why did I get myself in that situation where I end up making that mistake again? So out of obedience and with the desire to say yes to God, Abraham and Isaac, they load up and they head off on this trip of some 80 kilometers to Mount Moriah. But you'll notice in this story, Abraham doesn't say anything about this to his wife Sarah, because if he did that, then the plan's over. They're not leaving the house. It's like me. Before my wife started golfing, now I can't sneak away on my own anymore. But before she golfed, I would keep my clubs in the trunk of the car. And then, where are you going? Well, I've got some appointments that I have to go to. And then I'd go off to the golf course. My brother, one time I called his office in Charlottetown to get some financial advice. And his receptionist said, well, James has 18 appointments this afternoon. He's not available. So that's 18 holes of golf is what he had going on. So I understood this, and this was a long trip for an elderly man, and he must have been thinking, well, first of all, how am I going to do this emotionally, and how am I going to do this physically? And then in verse 4, on the third day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. So what's going through his mind as he's looking off in the distance and he sees Mount Moriah, probably a full day before they actually arrived there? He must have been just walking slowly, hoping God's going to change his mind and not make this request of me. But what would be going through his mind at that time? So then he said to his servants, "Stay here with the donkey. My son and I will go over there and worship, and then we will come back to you." Abraham took the wood for the sacrifice and gave it to his son to carry, but he himself took the knife and the fire. So he and his son went on together. So he's following through on what God has instructed. Everything is in place at this point. And a man by the name of Cavett Roberts said, "Maturity is the ability to stay with a resolution long after the mood in which the resolution was made has left." So Abraham is no doubt having second thoughts, and Satan is probably filling his mind with all kinds of things. He's whispering to him, "Oh, come on, Abraham. What kind of indecisive God is this that you worship? He tells you you're going to have all these descendants, and then you have this son, and he decides that you should take that son's life. What makes a God? What kind of God makes you choose anything over family?" But faithful Abraham, he just keeps walking along this walk of obedience, which inevitably leads to the moment of truth. And you've been there. The stakes are high, not as high as what Abraham is dealing with, but maybe you're at the neighborhood barbecue and somebody brings up the topic of religion, and you've just got this newfound faith, and you know you should speak up and say something, but you're afraid there'll be some ridicule and some scrutiny. So for you, it is a moment of truth. Or you're in your class, and the professor starts to mock Christianity, starts to mock anything in that area. And you're looking around you, and this is a big lecture auditorium, and you're thinking, surely somebody is going to stand up and defend Christianity. But nobody's moving, so you realize if you don't say something, then nobody is going to say anything. Or perhaps for you, things aren't going that great at work. But if you were to just kind of cut a few ethical corners, it could improve the financial bottom line, and you would look much better. It would be job security for you. So once again, it's a moment of truth. It was for Abraham, but all of our scenarios pale in comparison to what he faced. So we pick up now in verse 9. "And came to the place God had told him about, and Abraham built an altar there, and he laid wood on it, and then tied up his son Isaac and laid him on the wood on the altar." So and that's all it says. It doesn't tell us how this frail man of probably 112, 113 years of age was able to subdue a very energetic and active boy, possibly 12 to 13-year-old. So how did he get him there? Now, at the first service, my grandson, Seth, who's 12, was sitting in the front row. And I looked at Seth and I said, "Yeah, I could take you." But then Abraham would have been almost 50 years older than I am. And then I remembered Seth has been taking Taekwondo. So I'm expecting when I go home at lunch for our whole families together, he'll jump me or something, and I'm in trouble. But so how did this happen? Was there a physical struggle between the father and this son that he loved so dearly? Or did Abraham trick his son and get him up there on the altar and then tie him? Or maybe God caused the boy just to pass out so that he was unaware of what was happening, and Abraham was to tie him up at that point. Or did something else happen? We don't know. We're not told. And then the other question I ask is, did Isaac know that something was up? did he realize, there is something? Well, he would notice his father on the 3-day walk to get to Mount Moriah. There is something troubling him. And is this something that he just has to do? And maybe Isaac just allowed him to place him on that altar. Or did something else happen? We don't know. And then tied up his son Isaac, laid him on the wood on the altar. And then in verse 10, then Abraham took his knife and was about to kill his son. And can you just picture that? He would have the knife in the air. The tears would just be flowing down his cheeks, knowing God has asked me to do this, but I love this son, but I have to say yes to God. So it truly was a moment of truth for Abraham. And when you don't understand, would you have the faith in God to say yes? I hope you would. Actually, and I hope that I would. And actually, I've done that many times over my life. One of them was saying yes to coming here as pastor 35 years ago. I had this wonderful little rural congregation in Burt's Corner, actually Dornridge, New Brunswick. We lived in Burt's Corner, and it was a farming community, and I know farming, so I fit in very well. I was making all kinds of friends in the community, helping them do their barn work. And then I start getting people talking to me about the opening at this new church in Halifax. They've got 15 people, and they want to grow. And one old woman in Dornridge said, there are 100 of us here. Why would you go to Halifax for 15 people? But God called and we responded. And that leads us to the final stop on Abraham's journey. And that is the provision of God. So when you say yes to God, he promises to provide what you need, not necessarily what you want. And we don't know what form that's going to take, but trust in a perfect God who wants to reward his children for saying yes, even when we don't completely understand. So Genesis 22:11. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And Abraham answered, yes. And the angel said, don't kill your son or hurt him in any way. Now I can see that you trust God and that you have not kept your son, your only son, from me. So not only is the reward for saying yes to God, but he gets a commendation here. And it's also a foreshadowing of what will happen on a much larger redemptive scale in about 1,500 years when God does not withhold his one and only son. So Genesis 22:15. The angel of the Lord called to Abraham from heaven a second time and said, the Lord says, because you did not keep back your son, your only son, from me, I make you this promise by my own name. I will surely bless you and give you many descendants. They will be as many as the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore. And they will capture the cities of their enemies. Through your descendants, all the nations on the earth will be blessed because you obeyed me. Now, in some ways, you never really know where your heart is until God tests you. And you have to wrestle with him over something that's really important. When you think about kind of smothering your own will and desires and following his and saying yes to him. Or maybe when you realize here in our country, the biggest test for us is to say yes to God over our family, to make certain that he is number one. But fortunately, God won't ask you to sacrifice a child or a spouse, but he may ask you to reprioritize and make certain that God's will supersedes that of your family. And let's be honest, we're willing to move heaven and earth for our kids. We'll travel anywhere for Johnny to be involved in any sporting event because we're hoping he'll get a scholarship to play college. Then you've got to do it. Or we spend hundreds or thousands of dollars so that Susie can take vocal lessons or dance lessons or play an instrument. Or we can flip that around, or both of them can be doing all of that. But before you get upset with me, first of all, I want to say there's nothing inherently wrong with sports. I'm fully involved in them, or in music, or in the arts. But when was the last time that you or I, as a parent, invested that amount of time in God's work? When was the last time we invested financially in God's work? Or you heard me talk about the expansion of this building. Have you taken the opportunity to be a part of making room for more? You can still make pledges to that 3-year campaign. The people out at the Welcome Center will guide you through that. And there's actually another thing, and that is, when is the last time that you went on a missions trip, or have you ever considered something like that? Our missions ministry are actually having a meeting tomorrow night at 7 in the cafe just to talk about potential interest in going on a mission trip. So if you're interested, take that in. My concern is that the Isaacs get our prime attention, and if we aren't careful, God just kind of gets the leftovers. And in so doing, we say yes to our children and no to God. And for some of us, this is a significant test of our faith, because for some of us, our family is our life. But look what Jesus said here in Luke 14. Large crowds were traveling with Jesus, and he turned and said to them, "If anyone comes to me but loves his father, mother, wife, children, brothers or sisters, or even life more than me, he cannot be my follower. In the same way, you must give up everything you have to be my follower." Jesus actually said that? And now, to understand this, we have to realize that he's talking about the contrast here. He's not saying that you are to despise your relatives. He's saying that in contrast to your devotion to the Lord, it would appear as if you hate those members of your family. It's a stark contrast compared to your love for God. And he doesn't say, if you can't hate your family, then you're not a great disciple. And he doesn't say, then you're not a good disciple. But he says, you're not my disciple at all. So here's the point. Jesus wants you to love your family, but that should be second on your love list. He should be first. The bigger tests and the bigger risks bring the greater rewards. So if we say yes to God in this area, it's going to take the same thing that it took Abraham. It's going to take surrender. Romans 12 reminds us of that. So, brothers and sisters, since God has shown us great mercy, I beg you to offer your lives as a living sacrifice to him. Your offering must be only for God and pleasing to him, which is the spiritual way for you to worship. So when you don't understand, you have to surrender. And remember, it's easier to say no to something out here when there's that deeper burning yes inside of you. Now, some convictions don't really take much surrender of our will or surrender of our pride. I don't personally struggle with loving God more than my house, and I've done a lot of renovations on that house since we bought it from the church. I used to fuss over the hardwood floors, but the kids have beaten those floors up, so now I drop something on it, there's another dent. Doesn't bother me in the least. And I can say I love God easily above my hobbies, because I may end up going weeks, months at a time not being involved in that hobby. I can even say that I love God more than my job, even though my job is sharing the message about God. But change that question to, do you love God more than your family? For Abraham, it was loving God more than that son that was promised. So what would that level of sacrifice look like for you? Would it mean more worship services with your family and fewer weekends out of town? Would it mean that you would actually spend more time being intentional about discipling your own kids? My father-in-law, Alan Smith, was a pastor. And early on in my marriage to my wife, Pat, he said, look, I just wasn't around for my family. I was constantly busy with the church and neglecting my family. Make sure you don't do that. And I was determined starting off, but then I come to a church with 15 people, and I've got to work in order to build that church to a self-supporting spot. So I didn't do well enough in that area either. My 3 daughters have turned out to be incredible people. Well, I was hoping none of them would be at this service and I could say that. Then they'll expect me to say nice things all the time. For some of you, what this might mean is spending more time reading God's Word so that you can pass on that baton of faith. And maybe for others, it might be making the commitment to be baptized into Christ, even though you know some members of your extended family are going to have a hard time with it. It's saying yes to God's will, not your own will, and not your family's will. And the word is surrender. So surrender is just like holding up that white flag, and you're saying, I give up my rights, I give this over to you, Lord. Now, I've never experienced what Abraham did in almost losing his son Isaac. The closest that I came was when my daughter Shannon went through horrible health issues back in the spring, summer, fall of 2010. She was diagnosed with Crohn's disease in 2009, just slightly before she married James Stevenson, our other pastor. And that summer of 2010, she was just getting so thin, and she just figured this is a normal part of having Crohn's disease, but it wasn't. She wasn't getting proper medical care. And in mid-July, my wife Pat and I went to PEI for a 2-week vacation. Some friends loaned us their cottage, and we were just 4 days in. I had projects that I was going to do while I was there, but 4 days into that visit, I get a text message from Shannon. I still get emotional every time I think about it. And she just said, my stomach's all messed up and I've got to go in the hospital. And you know that we were home immediately after that. And I know people have received much news that is much worse than that, but that rocked our world at the time. We were expecting surgery after surgery for her, but there were some horrible tests that she went through. One of them, she went through the test and then they lost the results, so she had to go back through that scope again. But she found a good GI specialist, and they got her onto a biologic treatment that put her Crohn's into remission. So a year later, she had Seth, that grandson, and 6 years after that, she had our granddaughter, Jane. And during all of that, I was praying. And I was praying, God, make my daughter well. But it was also a prayer of surrender to God's will, because I wanted him to make his will clear to me. And in the last couple of years, Shannon has been having a lot of issues again, but our family doctor retired, but she has found an amazing doctor who's a member of Halifax Christian Church. She has found a new GI team, and they're working on that, and they're helping her get straightened out again. But I know some others here have gone through horrible things with their teenage daughter recently, Tim and Karen Cook. Tim, our worship leader today. And then we've got another family going through this with their 24-year-old daughter. So it's happening all the time. But we put our trust in God and allow him to come through. So we all hope to have Abraham's level of faith when we're tested, to be able to say, yes, God, even when we don't fully understand what he's asking us to do, even when we don't think it makes sense. But please notice that surrender is the life channel. It's kind of that conduit by which God's blessings are going to come into our life. And his biggest and his best blessings will flow through that conduit. Abraham chose God over his family. So this is a moment of truth for all of us. And there's no knife, and there's no altar, and we don't have a sacrifice that's going to be made here. It's just you and God. And he's asking you to say yes to following him completely, to surrender your life to him. And on that Friday, when the soldiers drove the nails into Jesus' hands, there was no voice from heaven, and there was no freeze frame like you see in movies where everybody's frozen and then someone comes in and rescues the person that they want to. God didn't do that. He allowed it all to happen in a way because he loved you more than he loved his own family. So maybe today is the day for you to say yes to him. And there are people here who will cheer you on. And if you say yes here, you can say yes out there as well.